Howdy. I'm Roy. I work for Netflix, and I'm here to talk about something that we actually did that was a relatively small effort that paid a huge dividend that I'm actually really excited about. One note, I was training for this with the assumption I could have a presenter's display, which means I would actually see what's coming up before I talk about it, and that's not happening. So I'm going to be seeing these things change, and then I'll talk about them. So just in terms of context, I've been at Netflix for almost about 4 years. I'm also fond of metrics, which is why I keep count of the days. This is hugely an aberration for me. My typical runtime at companies is like 2.5 years. At this time, I've had 6 titles. I've had 4 distinct jobs. And these days, I work as part of a group called Monitoring Engineering, which is a software development group within Netflix that's responsible for building and maintaining the telemetry and alerting platforms we use to actually know what's going on in production. Last night was fun for many of us. Sorry about that for anybody who was trying to stream. So I've got mostly an OPSI background, though I've been a software developer. I've run test and release engineering groups. I've been a network engineer. I've done a bunch of things. Mostly what I love is automation. So this conversation is not actually really about metrics per se. You know, if you think about metrics as time series, so it's maybe worth sort of disclaiming that I do actually really love metrics, which is good because I've got a whole bunch of them. In any given 2-week period, we go through about 1.2 billion different metrics. Every day, we get about 80 million new metrics that we report on, and 80 million metrics, leave us. And in the end, it all comes down to this, right? I mean, time series data. So this is actually a really useful graph for those of you who can read it. This is global calls in queue, which literally means phone calls. These are phone calls into our customer service organization, and there's no better way to know whether or not your customers are pissed off at you right now than to look at this. There's a black line and a red line here. The black line is last week, the red line is this week. And when your graph looks like this, you know you're in pretty decent shape because, we're not seeing anything worse than last week. So that's great. And this way, your customers can alert you when you've got a problem, which is a good first step, though we don't really pay them well enough to be, QA testers for us. So, eventually you probably add another graph, which is, for example, this is the number of streams started every second. It's even harder here to see that there's a black and a red line because they're so evenly matched. But, again, when they're evenly matched, it's pretty good. You're on target. There's probably no problem in the environment. But, really, that just gives you everything, and you might want to know something on a more like device level. So you add another, graph or two to look at. And, on the left side, you've got Nintendo Wii activity. On the right side, you've got what we call legacy CE, which is a bunch of relatively old televisions and Blu-ray devices. And that all looks good. And, you just sort of naturally follow this to its logical conclusion. And then you die. So let's take a breather for a second to talk away from metrics to talk about change control. Who here is a big fan of change control, by the way? Oh, thank God. OK, so change control has some good things going for it. I think we can all agree that it's good to know what changed in your environment. It's sometimes good to know what's going to change. And in systems that are really tightly coupled, that can be really important because you can sometimes do mutually exclusive changes that will result in badness. On the flip side, it requires a lot of manual effort. And quite often, by the way, it requires manual effort that is completely disproportionate with the risk and size of the change. Has anybody here ever had to file some sort of change control ticket where the amount of time you had to spend on filing the ticket was longer than the amount of time it was going to take to do the change? And lastly, it really talks about intent, not execution. You're talking about what it is that you're going to do, not what it is that actually happens. You're also talking about when it is that you think you're going to do it, not actually when you're going to do it. Back when we actually had change control tickets in Netflix, and theoretically at least they were required by the process for changes, the end result of that, of having really smart engineers who get to do what they think needs to be done, is people would open a change control ticket whose well, I'm not going to talk about start time and end time because it's really about the start date and the end date. It would be like a 3-month change control ticket to cover all activities for a given system. So that sucks, and it happens because people don't really like doing change control, even the stuff that we know is valuable. So what's the problem that we're dealing with here? This is a graph from December 24th, 2012. Okay, annoying laugh. So at about 12:27 p.m., this is the number of hosts, of healthy hosts in an ELB in Amazon, the load balancer at Amazon, serving basically the large customer base we have for streaming. Now you'll notice that the red line here is much higher than the black line, and that's because on 12/24 we were seeing a blockbuster day that was way, way, way higher volume for a while than the previous week. Because, well, 12/24 was a Monday, but it was Christmas Day. Most people are at home, you know, not spending time with their families, but rather streaming movies. And so everything's good until 12:27 when the red line suddenly goes to 0. And then the next thing that happens is that the streams per second, which is basically, you know, supposed to be growing faster than last week, starts like jittering like crazy. So we see this massive drop here, and then it starts sort of slowly going down, and then it even gets even worse, and you know you're having a bad day, and then you see this. And people in the back probably can't see this very well. So here's what's going on. This is the same sort of graph that I talked about earlier. This is calls in queue for our customer service organization. But this time it's broken up by reason. So there's a graph here for marketing and sign up, account and billing, DVD and shipping. One of these lines is watch instantly. Anybody want to take a guess as to which one it is? So this was bad. And then the thing is, every time something like this happens, fundamentally, the first question we ask is, okay, who broke stuff? Because it turns out that something changed. In our environment, especially at the speed we're going, the vast majority of stuff, when things break, it's because somebody broke them. Sometimes it's not, but most of the time it is. And usually it's actually intentional work by somebody. They didn't intend to break something, but they intended to change something. And it's actually even useful to know when it's not the case that it's driven by a change, because as it is, because we focus so much on a change, being able to rule it out quickly is really, really useful to us. So about a year ago, we had a site reliability engineer in our SRE group, and we had this conversation with our director, the guy that I work for, and he said, you know, we'd love some sort of prod alert dashboard that actually talks about like the processes we follow to, you know, rule out things, and, you know, where are we in dealing with this issue. Why don't you look into that? And the SRE looked at that and was like, yeah, that's not that interesting, actually. I don't think I want to do that. So what he did instead was he built this thing. And what this thing does is you tell it what changed. You just do, you know, HTTP posts to it via a REST interface. And you don't tell it what you intend to change. You don't tell it when you're going to intend to change, when you're intending to make that happen. You tell it, right now, this is what actually happened. You tell it to it automatically. We haven't even built an interface for humans to write something to it, though when we launched it, I actually did a hand curl command to announce right around the same time we were starting this thing called Scotch Friday. So I announced that Scotch Friday is starting. We've not yet correlated, by the way, Scotch Friday with outages. I think we're afraid of the answers. And then, you know, once it has all these things, you know, you just ask it questions like, you know, what changed? So that's it. That's all it really does. This was like a 2 or 3 week period of work that wasn't even like full time. This is a sample JSON that you post to it. You know, it has a source, a region, an environment, an app type, reference URL, detail, and description. And I think, frankly, it's pretty self-explanatory. If anybody has any questions about what these fields mean, go ahead and ask. But it's pretty much whatever you want it to mean. You can also send, by the way, any other key value in there. We'll store it, and you'll be able to query for it. But this is sort of what's required. And just as in terms of, and what you end up with is basically a little dashboard that lets you filter based on various elements and see what activity has happened, for example, in the last hour. It turns out that these days, when we have an outage, the first thing we look at is what's actually happened over the last like 15 minutes. I would talk about what these lines mean, but frankly, since I don't think anybody can see them clearly, it doesn't really matter. So from an MVP perspective, all you really want to do is you want to take events, you want to show an event timeline, and probably in terms of storage and capacity and all of that, you really only care about the last hour. It turns out that the vast majority of the time, even a year later when we've got a lot more data in it, we really only care about the last hour. And we started off with a sampling of events because not all systems could be easily instrumented to send events to this thing. And it turned out that even with a relatively small sampling of events, by choosing what we wanted to focus on first, it turned out to be useful really, really, really quickly. Since then, we've done some work to make it easier to slice and dice on event queries. We're working on creating a filter and publication system so you can actually get events pushed into your system if you want to notice things like RSS, et cetera. And one of the things that we've been working pretty hard on is actually pushing more and more interesting events into the system. So for example, one of the things I did, until recently I owned something called Security Monkey at Netflix, which actually notices when you change security groups. Because security people get annoyed at AWS because there's no like change log or even like notice that somebody changed a security group, which when you've got like 1,000 security groups and some SOCs and PCR related systems can be kind of hilarious. So Security Monkey basically solved that problem, sends an email to security people, but actually logs the change into this process and actually logs the previous and the new configuration, which has actually caused us to find a few situations where somebody made a security group unnecessarily restrictive with fun results. And then the next thing that we're looking at these days is adding a criticality feature. Criticality feature is actually kind of useful for us, and we hadn't really considered it, not because it's going to allow us to surface really critical events, but because it's going to allow us to feed really non-critical events into the system. We have an alerting system that gets something on the order of about 300,000 alerts a day. And at some point, we actually decided that all of these alerts would be kind of useful to have in this system. And they kind of are, except that when you've got an extra 300,000 events going into this timeline system, not being able to easily filter out stuff that's relatively low value means it's completely useless. So we've stopped doing that. So criticality will mean that it'll be much easier to start noticing what's actually important in terms of things have changed. We're talking about both manual and potentially sort of automated ways to notice criticality. And then the other thing is alerts, which I love. I mean, I've been a sysadmin for a long time, right? And you know, I love cron, and I love having stuff run every once in a while. And the problem that I've always tried to solve in every company that I've been in, and everybody sort of comes up with their own solution, is how do you know when something didn't happen? And how do you know when something didn't finish successfully? Well, the really easy answer when you have something like this is, when you finish successfully, post a, hey, I'm done event into the system. And once you've got alerts on this, so you can configure an alert if you haven't seen some sort of event for a given time period, you get a great sort of, noticing when something doesn't happen kind of alerting. We think this is going to be particularly useful for this sort of batch stuff. So basically, just in terms of summary for this thing, right? It's really not hard. It's not really special. It's not like IP. It's not going to make or break your company. And I'm not even saying that you have to build it for yourself. I think Datadog, for example, has a pretty decent SaaS offering. I haven't used them, but the fact that at least one SaaS out there does this suggests that it's something that you might be able to just pay for. But I got to tell you, I'm not a big evangelist. I'm not a big you should do things this way kind of guy. I've been around the block a few times to know that whatever smart people do, chances are is a pretty decent way to do it, and there's a bunch of ways to do it. But in this case, this is the one time that when I talk to my developers, I tell them that if you're not doing this, you're basically running around with a sharp stick poking your eye out. And that's all I've got. So, questions? Well, I expected this to be pretty... Yeah.
Netflix open sources a lot of software. Are you guys thinking about releasing it
It's NABPAA. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you this. I don't know if we're capturing questions in the filming, but the question was, given that we open source a bunch of things, are we thinking of open sourcing this? Yes, I think it'll be relatively easy to open source this, certainly from a policy perspective. There's no question about it. But I got to tell you, I mean, again, we had an SRE come up with a first draft of this in like 2 or 3 weeks. So you can wait until we open source this, and that'll make us feel good and warm inside because hey, more people use our stuff. But this doesn't feel like one of those things that I would say you should wait for. Based on the informal conversations I've had with people in this room, not everybody, but like the people I've chatted with, I suspect anybody in this room could probably come up with something like this pretty easily and without a lot of effort. Any other questions?
So with your tool, is the goal to actually automatically identify the cause of failure?
The question was, will the tool automatically identify the cause of failure? No, the tool will not automatically identify the cause of failure, though that would be awesome. We're hiring, but no, the goal was to fundamentally answer the question, what changed in our environment? And from that perspective, the tool does a fantastic job. It turns out that the tool was doing a fantastic job relatively early on when we had only about 50% of what was happening in our environment reported to it. Now we have a much better coverage. But really, from a fairly early point in this tool's life at our environment, it's been very useful in helping us identify things that change in our environment, and because we have a pretty decent understanding of our environment, which of these things are likely to have been culprits. So, to be honest, the vast majority of changes that actually cause us problems are rollouts of new code. I know that's shocking. And so code rollouts are particularly interesting to us. And in the latest version of the tool, these are actually going to be highlighted automatically for us. In fact, also shocking, some teams' rollouts are more prone to problems than other teams. I'm not naming names because this is being recorded. So being able to highlight that is really useful. So this tool doesn't tell us what actually broke. It doesn't necessarily tell us what the cause is, but it does tell us what happened and whether or not we should focus on what happened or look at a completely sort of open field of, okay, let's figure out what's actually broken here. Because we find that just starting with, well, we have no idea what's going on, let's try to sort of like try anything to figure out what actually is broken, takes a lot more time than we think it's probably this. Let's eliminate this first and then move on. Did that answer your question? Cool.
Did it help you with your Christmas failure? Because that really wasn't your issue, was it? It was somebody else's change.
So I should have known somebody would notice that. We don't usually have huge outages. So when I was looking for graphs of catastrophic events, I had to go back all the way to 1224 to get a really dramatic graph. But yes, actually, that's a good, actually it did help us, and I'll tell you why it helped us. Because very quickly, we were able to go, yeah, we didn't change anything. Hey, Amazon? When all of your hosts in an ELB suddenly go offline, and you haven't done a rollout, you haven't changed the number of hosts in the ASG, you haven't done any sort of like configuration change. Well, if you can validate that in like a minute or two, which we could, it makes it much quicker to go to the next step, which is to blame Amazon. To work collaboratively with Amazon to identify the root cause and together come to a solution faster.
What's the scope of what you're thinking about putting in there? Are you thinking about doing things like backup events or things that may or may not cause disruption that happen automatically, or is it always human change control that you're putting in?
No, the vast majority of changes at this point in the system are not human originated. So everything that's human originated definitely goes into the system, and that's the first thing that we did. But if you think about Chaos Monkey, how many people here are familiar with Chaos Monkey? Actually, has anybody here not heard of Chaos Monkey? Perfect. So, Chaos Monkey kills instances, right? And that's totally automatic, and it happens all the time. I mean, all the time. And we actually have Chaos Monkey log what instance of what application it killed every time it does something like that. Not because we expect it to be a problem. In fact, I would tell you that generally speaking, we don't expect it to be a problem. And one time it was. Another example is latency tests. We have these automatic repeating latency tests where we just induce an error rate or an artificial latency on a service because, that's how we roll in production. And it's really useful to have that be logged, even if you're not expecting problems. So no, actually, I would say don't look for what you know is probably going to be problematic. That's a good step. Get that in there first. But we want to have pretty good complete coverage of everything, because one of these days that's going to be useful. And look, here's the thing. Again, I mentioned the last hour is useful, right? We pretty much discard everything we have in the system if it's older than about 30 days, because we just don't care. So the storage capacity here is not all that impressive, even at our volume. Did that answer your question? Good. Yeah.
You started talking about how code rollouts are the big changes that make a difference. I can very much imagine this sort of thing where this sounds a lot like looking at version control logs to a certain point. And I can imagine how as you're digging down to a change, you're suddenly at the point where you want to hand off to the version control log. And just sort of thinking, in general, what this brings up is at what point are you saying, you know what, no, this tool is not for this sort of change. At this point, I should be moving off to looking at the version control log for this sort of change. How do you bound yourself for I'm doing too much in this thing? Or is that not a problem yet?
Maybe so the question was basically, how do you balance between what should go into this system versus, for example, a change control system? It's just a simpler way to put it, really. So I would say for us, it's less of an issue because the people who are the primary consumers of this, which is our operations group, fundamentally, once we figure out that some sort of change happened in an edge application, all we really need to do at that point is basically go, hey guys, who's on call? Good evening. Sorry to disturb you at your dinner. It's your problem. Have a nice day. Let us know how it's going. So there's not a lot of need to really dig deep into it. Partially also because, to be honest, even those guys don't necessarily need to figure out what changed in the sense of why it is that it's actually broken. We do a pretty standard thing, red-black pushes, right? So we bring up a new cluster at the same time that the old cluster was here. So frankly, one of the things that we really focus on when we deal with production outages is no root cause analysis right now, right? Some people love doing root cause analysis, and that's a good thing, but not right now. So the first thing that people like that will do is not look at change control. It's stop it. And generally speaking, stop it is the right approach. And we get back to a good position, and then we have a more leisurely conversation with them the day after when everybody's awake and less cranky. Did that answer your question? Cool. Other questions?
I have one more. So the query interface to this, do you just curl with the time range? Do you have a web interface?
Oh yeah, we have this web interface that we built. Yeah, and it's gotten more sophisticated since then. The thing is, this web interface is basically just a JavaScript page that does a bunch of REST calls, and so this is the web interface. And you can also save. You can see a permalink link. This blurry blue text here that you can't read says permalink. So you can always basically save a particular query as a as a bookmark, or you can do your own queries against the system via REST. We're big fans of REST for internal tools for, I think, pretty obvious reasons.
How granular are the categories? Do you pretty much just try to assign it to a team because then they're responsible right now for fixing it, or do you guys say just source code or security groups?
So I don't know. The question was how granular the categories are. So there's a bigger context about Netflix culture, which basically says, you know, thou shalt not be a gatekeeper, nor shall you tell anybody how to do their job. Categories are completely open-ended. There's not even, and this may be a gap, but there's not even a suggested list of categories to use. Whoever reports things to this system should figure out what categories make sense for them, which also means you'll end up with a bunch of possibly duplicates and less useful stuff. And then it becomes sort of an interesting sort of process of making sure that people know when you're saying, you know, this category means this, that, well, that category means that. Thankfully, you can actually, there's a description, which tends to be much more useful than the category.
Yeah, just imagine you want to assign it to someone who would then be responsible for fixing it. Because if it's too abstract, then it's like, well, it's not my problem. It's like something in a bug tracker that goes.
Right. So generally speaking, this is used for, where this is really, really useful for us is relatively big cross-functional outages. And when I say relatively big, I'm not talking about like, you know, 1224 big. I'm talking about like relatively big, like as in a 2 to 4% drop in streaming. And that kind of stuff we end up having enough people interested in. Plus, not to be sort of lazy about it, but we tend to hire engineers who don't tend to shirk that kind of stuff. So that's not my job, or that's not really my thing to deal with, is not typically the problem that we deal with here.
So one thing I've seen a lot of visualization people do is they try to marry their, you know, line graphs or other type of dashboard visualizations with change to kind of figure out,
Totally,
you know,
yeah.
can you marry these two concepts together so people can actually get to an MTTR really quickly? Have you guys thought about potentially marrying these two concepts?
Yeah, totally. So the question was, hey, wouldn't it be nice to like marry time series graphs in like, you know, event timelines? And that would totally make sense. And in fact, you know, I hate to plug a company that I actually don't have any sort of, you know, work with, or that doesn't pay me, but I think Datadog does that. Check them out. Anyway, in fact, that's a really good idea. The thing is, what I'm actually trying to do here, and the reason I'm interested in talking to people about this, is not the end state of all the awesome whiz-bang things you can do with this. It's without getting to the point of doing all those whiz-bang cool things, which are totally cool, without doing any of that stuff, we've gotten tremendous value out of this. We looked at a quarter-over-quarter TTR, and our MTTR went from like abysmal to not very bad because of this. And I'm partially not remembering the exact numbers, but I think it was like 40 minutes or something that we saved by not having to figure out who the hell pushed code. So yes, that would be useful. That would be cool. The question is, of course, what is it? You know, so I mentioned I have about 1.2 billion metrics. I did the math earlier today. If I basically just had one graph of them, one graph for each of those metrics, and I could just put it in one pixel, I would need 230 Retina display MacBook Pros to put all of those together. So how do you marry like a huge collection of time series and a huge collection of events? We haven't yet figured it out, partially because we've not been really motivated, because we don't think it's going to be like, it's going to give us that much value. I think I saw somebody else have a question. Oh, perfect. Good. Any other questions before I get dragged off the stage with a big hooked thing?
I lost my hook.
Damn it. Okay. Good. Well, hey, thanks a lot. Thanks for letting me talk to you.